Continuing with the Chinese case, we see how Confucianism played an important role in Chinese culture and had shaped the Chinese culture. This Confucianism is there is a strong sense of deference to elders and superiors and not questioning, in a sense of not doing things that will disrupt social harmony. And as a result, the China that we saw, certainly during the imperial period, was a totalitarian autocratic state and had a strong patriarchal culture where the man was seen more important than the women, or men were allowed to do certain things that women were not, and a very highly stratified society where if you are born a peasant, you basically died a peasant. And maybe some openings when it came to merchant class, but otherwise you are either aristocracy or a military or perhaps in the merchant class or you are a peasant. I'm not loving it. So moving ahead, um, China relationship with the rest of the world was rather limited. China was kind of cut itself off from the rest of the world. Some people went and explored and traded with China somewhat, but it was largely independent from the rest of the world and doing so with a sense of cultural superiority, with an idea that these barbarians from the West really were used to killing each other and were coming up with inventions that we Chinese had already invented long ago. I think a big movement in the Chinese history then would have to be when Britain intruded in 1830s and 1840s through the Opium War, basically trying to push the opium be brought into China, which of course resulted in a lot of addiction. But to have something to trade, right? The Chinese said, we don't want this. And then the British sent in warship and said, we are going to blow up your harbors and your coastal towns if you don't accept our trade. I mean, free trade, right? So this really pried open uh, China to foreign investments, um, in the sense international trade, but it also humiliated China. The ease with which just a couple of ships could bring this huge empire to its knees, all right? And we should keep that in mind, right? That the attitude of China towards West was one of at times now feeling the inferior and feeling that West is violent and intruding in Chinese affair. And that is something that led to the way China is today. So that's enough of Imperial China. Let's move on to talk about the Republic of China. Again, I suggest maybe a film that really allows you to delve into that would be The Last Emperor of China, that movie. It's a little bit of long film, but it gives you a lot of rich history of China and the decision of China to go away from monarchy, not only because they wanted to have democracy, but because they wanted to be a nation state and one that was much more modern than the old clunky empire, which is very loosely organized and really one of the leading forces for pushing for not just the removal of emperor, but creating a Republic of China was the nationalist. What was this group called Nationalist Party, which initially tried to unite the country. mm, um, but ran into problems because, again, China was so decentralized. There were a lot of general regional warlords, and the central political party couldn't overcome them. So, to help overcome them, to help unify the country, the Nationalist Party reached across to the communist. The Chinese Communist Party back in 1924, and together these two forces, which were for unifying the country, again one in somewhat more democratic line, like the Nationalist Party, and but then trying to create a nation state, and the communist bonded together. So that's what brought them together, like communist and nationalist party. And now that all worked very nicely, uh, this coming together and working worked nicely initially until 1927. The National Party leader Chiang Kai-shek um, turned on the communists in 1927 and chased them away. They were forced into rural northwest province of Yunnan, uh, where they hid amidst the peasants there. The National Party didn't have enough power to wipe them out completely, but they certainly drove them to the far corners, and that might be the way of things. It would have stayed at, say that it would have stayed that way had it not been for the aggression of a much smaller country, but much more ambitious country of Chinese coast. And we are talking about, of course, the Japan. Japan is a first non-Western country to defeat one of the Western powers in 1905. The Japanese defeated the Russian army. I mean, in a way, it's a navy. I guess more importantly, Japan had started this drive towards modernization and westernization earlier with Meiji Reformation already in the 1800s, and as such it was more industrialized and it was more militarized and more in line to compete with West than China was, and as such it was able to attack China even though it was much bigger and conquer uh, most part of China. In 1937, Japan invades China before World War II. World War II is a Western uh, conception from 1939 through 1945, but things were already happening before then. And when Japan invaded, not only did they take over, but the Nationalist Party fled to southwest corners of China, which is which was, I mean, um, uh, on the opposite side of the north east, which where the communists were hiding. And so we are talking about that the communists were hiding up in the northwest, and down southwest is where um, the nationalists fled. And there is all the coastal cities were under the Japanese control. So Japan was occupying China, but of course, Japan in the end lost the World War II, couldn't keep up on two front, subduing both China, but having awakened the military colossus of United States, Japan eventually surrenders. And what had happened during this war was, while the nationalists were trying to save their own skin and hide out, communists were mm, started to started to make friends with peasants in the region where they were hiding. and engaging in some guerrilla warfare, and bombing roads, killing Japanese soldiers, and things of that sort when they strayed that far into north west. So they were much more active in engaging Japan than the nationalists, who were basically just hiding out, trying to survive. So when Japan surrendered, we find that the Chinese communists were much more fitter, in the sense that they had been keeping active. They knew how to wage war, and they are much more popular. They were trying to actually do something to rid China of the Japanese when the nationalists were not. And when they had a conflict, the two of them, for the control of country after Japanese left, it was nationalists who lost this time, and they fled to the island of Taiwan. After about 4 years of civil war period, now the, the leader of Communist Party is someone whom we definitely have to know. Probably the most important uh, Chinese person. I don't know. I guess one could argue maybe Confucius, but the other major figure in Chinese history is, of course, Mao Zedong, who practiced a type of communism which was different from the top-down model which Stalin was practicing in Russia. So the Chinese model was always looking at the Russian model, um, but also individual from it. Let's explore a little bit about the People's Republic of China. You have to keep in mind Taiwan is the Republic of China, and the People Republic is the communist regime. China has kind of the split identity, especially in the early days after the World War. The West only acknowledged Taiwan or Republic of China and not the People Republic of China. And that, of course, helped to create major divisions between the China and the West. Only Russia was the one which acknowledged China. So let's talk about People's Republic of China. I like to always say one thing of my rules is that when you have country that has that world peoples in front of them, uh, it's the people aren't running it. It's almost the same thing as democratic regimes like GDR, Democratic Republic of Germany, German Democratic Republic, GDR. That was, of course, with the communist, and one has to put democratic in its name to get some sense of legitimacy in general, but not the democratic one as opposed to the Federal Republic of Germany, which is actually the democratic regime. So let's talk about PRC, or People Republic of China under Mao. So, as a communist regime, it had some progressive policies, land redistribution to peasants, ownership among the peasants, not uh, um, the large landowners, but the peasants would own them. No, the peasant wouldn't own them. The state owned them, and the peasant would work on them, right? And then again, something kind of reflecting women's right. Not that they were involved much in the leadership, but certainly they could be active in the party in the same way that men could do now. Mao himself, as a leader, again uh, viewed quite popularly as something of a freedom fighter, somebody who fought against Japan and did not cover or hide away, and somebody who was generally close to people. We're going to see how this actually hurts Mao a little bit. Uh,